Hello YouTube, this is Morgan, Airspeed Prime, with another Avatar news update video. The Netflix Avatar stuff just keeps on happening once again, just based on the little clip that we got from the Netflix What's Next kind of stream that they had kind of planned. Just a few seconds of footage. I wasn't really planning to do a video just on that, but then IGN dropped another big interview about the show that's actually pretty interesting, and it's like, okay, we have to cover this. It's another lengthy interview, but we will quickly cover the Bumi stuff. So Albert Kim, after it came out, did post a sort of kind of hero shot of King Bumi. So very nice here, just getting to see a kind of closer shot of just kind of full body kind of Bumi here, doing some earth bending with both hands. You get a better look at the design here, the armpit hair, what the kind of eyebrow hair, beard situation is, the general look. Along with it, you get to look at the background quite a bit as well. There's the Earth Kingdom or Earth bending symbol in the background there. I maintain that I think Bumi is still probably the one character where I think they were just always going to have a very difficult task getting him perfectly correct. I think this is a very, very good effort, but still the one character I'd go like doesn't quite fit in my mind this like ideal vision of kind of Bumi in live action, but I acknowledge that it's this nearly impossible task because Bumi in the show is almost this kind of otherworldly character because of like he has a pretty almost unique body shape, and like because of how old he is, it's very difficult to do that kind of accurately. And in a way, like some sort of stuff they talk about the adaptation in the interview, which we'll get to in just a second, Bumi kind of represents some of that. You can't leave him out, but it's going to be maybe really hard to get the exact details of every make him perfect across. Still, kind of more of a nitpick with me rather than anything too much. I think maybe the thing holding me back on him is that we haven't seen the performance yet. I think the actors have given pretty good praise to the performance here. And when we see the more humorous stuff, like maybe when he's hiding his identity from Aang, if they're still doing that stuff at the start, and all the jokes from, the King of Amashu episode, that will really help to make me kind of see him as Bumi a little bit more than just the fight scene visuals that we've seen so far. Then when it comes to this, we'll come to that second. In terms of the stream, the Netflix stream, it was just like a 3.5 minute thing that quickly showed a clip of every single show that they had announced was going to be shown at this. So I went in not knowing what it was going to be. In the end, we get about 5-ish seconds, probably more like 4 seconds of Avatar footage here. And it is this little clip of Aang versus Bumi. So you see Aang block and then jump to the side to dodge. Pretty nice, and immediately keeps... I like this whole thing because it's like Aang keeps moving, keeps kind of the spiral movements going. Bumi's more kind of direct, and then you see the big rock here, he kind of like earth bends, kind of sucks it towards him, and you get the very kind of animation-esque, back arching jump over the rock, which is very, very Avatar. So looks good, and I think it solved what to me was maybe my worry with earthbending, based on what we had seen from the previous Bumi clip, which was that we mainly saw him kind of throwing a large amount of kind of small rocks, kind of pebbles at Aang, and I was worried like, ooh, is that the way they're doing earthbending, just making it very kind of flowy dirt, not really like compressed, not really rocks. But no, here we see that there is in fact big rocks involved as well. So it'll be interesting to see other earthbenders, if we see too many of them in the series, or just more of Bumi's earthbending, how they vary that overall. Because again, going back to this, you can see there's some decent kind of sized rocks here, which I do appreciate. But I do wonder like how much of the really solid earthbending that we typically expect we are going to see. But I think it's a good look. It's a solid look at earthbending overall. Also on Twitter, they did post the sort of like cast reaction to this, where they kind of combined the two Bumi clips we have together. Mainly, it's just a quick kind of sub 1 minute thing mainly highlighting kind of Gordon's kind of time on the set. How did they do the backflip? It's a fun little behind the scenes thing, but not too much to really talk about there. So yeah, we'll get into this big Netflix interview here, which is this one longer than the EW one? It's probably somewhat equivalent, but I feel it goes a little bit more in depth, or it's just presented to us in a more direct way that feels more in depth. Again, I'm not going to read out the entire thing. I will link it below so you can read it if you want. I have some bits highlighted because it does tackle some of the exact same questions that have been asked in other interviews and so on. So the video's not just hours going through the full thing. I have highlighted just a few points. So after the kind of intro stuff, how they got into Avatar, the kind of pressures of what's going on here, the question comes up, basically thoughts on your adaptation effectively. And Albert Kim says, I've used the term that this is a remix, not a cover, in that you've got to hit a lot of familiar notes, but you can't forget that this is supposed to be a new song. So obviously there are story points and characters that you have to do fairly faithfully from the original, but at the same time, you're literally translating something from 2D to 3D. That meant dimensionalizing the story, taking it into new places, filling in some gaps. So somewhat similar in line to what he has said before, but this time bringing in the remix, not a cover angle, which is probably the ideal way to look at this overall. He says some more stuff again about the Southern Air Temple attack being here. That's a different, them showing more of an action scene, I guess, around Ozai Zuko, which I still want to see how exactly that plays out. But they're kind of highlighting that they're still making sure that it feels like Avatar in spirit. Now, if you saw my review of Netflix One Piece, this was kind of my big thing coming out of that show, was that I felt like they got the spirit of One Piece kind of spot on, and that was what fundamentally meant that show, I think, succeeded, that they weren't afraid for it to, at its core, just be One Piece and have a lot of those elements while still being kind of different than the live action version. So I like the mention of that definitely gives me confidence that, like, because those two shows were kind of almost by Netflix made almost following a similar path, it gives me hope for this one, and that they're going to get that right, and that will come through in the final product, that even if we don't appreciate every single change, that it still feels like Avatar overall in spirit. The core of it is what we know. Then we get to sort of some stuff about kind of tonally and how they're doing it here. The main things that stood out to me was just like this kind of line here. And so it had to feel grounded and mature and adult in that way. So that's, like I said, the tightrope we have to walk, is that they want to keep some of the sort of, in a way, goofiness, the humor, some of that silliness, but they also are aware that they want to have the appeal in a way, not just that it maybe comes across as much like a kid's show, is sort of the line they're trying to tight walk here, basically. And then they mention here kind of how they approached getting the tone right, of like, they have the script and then they're on set, and they basically just did different versions that got across different kind of tonal aspects, basically. Let's do a sillier version, and let's try even sillier than that, let's pull it back. And then they could choose which kind of versions of scenes to put together to make the overall kind of best kind of one that fit the best in terms of what they were going for. So that's an interesting one. Then they get into some stuff about the kind of characters. Again, it's sort of just, the audition process. It's more of a behind the scenes kind of type thing about what they were looking for. But then we get down kind of here of like, do you ever wonder about it getting too dark? Like, you're trying to maybe make it a little bit more dramatic. Is there a line, basically? So it was just a matter of being true to the story. And then later we would, sort of turn the dials a little bit here and there. Like Jabbar said, we had different versions of a lot of scenes. And then after we watched it all cut together, we'd say, maybe we should dial back a little here. Maybe we have room to go further here. And that's how they more or less did it. It was never really a conversation that was directly had about the kind of level of darkness. Just because I suppose that they're respecting the original show here, is that like, it already was like kind of a level beyond your typical kids show already. So they maybe just, I suppose the idea they're getting across here is that, especially for book one, they just emphasize that stuff a little bit more with stuff like the air nomad genocide being involved here right at the start. The question comes up about Azula in terms of like, hey, what's kind of going on with her? Because she's only in book one a tiny bit. You're obviously emphasizing her a little bit in the trailer, so what's going on here? And the way they word it here, without going into like the detail, is more or less what they've said before. Plus, they say this, so we could pull some of those elements up front into the first season and make the first season a little bit richer and a little bit deeper in terms of character storylines. And the quote here is also somewhat interesting in terms of he talks about how the original show, of course, had to be made as it went on. They have the benefit of hindsight, being able to be like, hey, we can maybe move some of the development backstory that happens in like season 2 into season 1 to just kind of spread the kind of love out a little bit across the seasons. And he then goes on to say that, like, if anything, Azula's story in the first season is a little bit of a prequel to her story in the second and third seasons. But that's another element that we thought we should rather... But that's another element that we thought we should see rather than just talk about. So yeah, they're just kind of saying that they're not really going to talk about the exact details of Azula, but I think we get a bit of a sense for what's going on here. So they're framing it as this will be a prequel to what's going on here. It's still probably a little bit unclear what exactly is going on here in terms of like, is it just she hangs out in the Fire Nation and then maybe towards the end of the season she gets sent out on a mission to some Earth Kingdom town? They seem to kind of be, I think, implying, based on what we know, the fact that May and Ty Lee are going to be in the season. I think they're highlighting that they're bringing in her, forming her team into season 1. And it feels like they're getting some of maybe the season 2 intro stuff out of the way at the end of season 1, just so Azula's ready to go properly for season 2. So I kind of guess start off with a bang and they can get right into the kind of meatier plots that happen in season 2. That's at least my thoughts on it. Now, the question obviously comes up about, like, I suppose, Omashu. Like, will it be Azula potentially attacking Omashu? Might they kind of change the order of some of this stuff, like, slightly? I think we know Omashu's, like, the 3rd episode, so I think we know where that's going to be placed, but is that what we're going for here? Like, that there's some sort of initial stuff, we get the usual Omashu episode, but then Azula kind of has an Omashu side plot highlighting that this is how it got taken over by the time we come back to it in season 2. That kind of feels like in or around what they're going to be doing here, because that fits with like May's story, and you can roll Ty Lee into that as well. I think that makes sense to a certain degree. But yes, then we get into this. The question, and I like this is why I think this is one of the better interviews about the show, is that the person obviously knows what they're talking about. That mentions the idea that there are graphic novels, books. Did you pull anything from those sources? Albert Kim just mentions that they're a fan of that. They know about the comics, novels. They went through all that stuff. There's rich material that we drew on from there. And I think some fans will be very excited to see that. Other fans, it'll be new to them because they haven't gone through that kind of stuff. I'm not sure we should talk about spoilers. Now, the obvious point I think they're referring to here probably is Avatar Kuruk, especially. Avatar Kyoshi, I think, obviously, but there is at least some content in the show later on to draw on, but there's much more from the novels. I'm guessing that's mainly what they're talking about, like Escape from the Spirit World, which basically is the core kind of foundation of the development that FCE did in the novels for, Kuruk, Yangchen, and Kyoshi. So I'm guessing that's most of it. A lot of the other comics, like most of the comics, are basically like book 4. It's effectively book 4 of Avatar is what most of the trilogies are. So it'll be interesting to see what they exactly kind of are referring to by a lot of that stuff. Like, say, like Ko. He even mentions Ko at one point here. We know Ko is in, of course. Are they going to address like the Mother of Faces? Like, are they going to, whenever they get around to like Zuko's mother, Ursa, like, are they going to cover some of the search story in this? Could be interesting, but I'm assuming it is more like the Avatar stuff. I think that seems to be the stuff that we know that they're going to address, because otherwise, how does Kuruk properly come into play? How does Kyoshi properly come into play? That's the kind of main questions. But yeah, mentions that, yeah, we read them. We can add a little more dimension to some of the elements of the story, weave together new threads, and it's a process of making it feel like a serialized drama rather than an adventure of the week that the original show was. And he does, I think, as they go on here, specify that it's more of a... They fixed this for the most part in season 2 and 3. It's more that season 1 kind of needed the little bit of extra kind of help to bring it together into this format, which does make sense. And that's exactly what this question is about, of like, hey, you've got 8-hour-long episodes versus like 20-minute episodes. That's the challenge. That's fundamentally what ruined the movie. You tried to do this in like 100 minutes. I think it's under 100 minutes last time I checked. It was never going to work. Here, though, they've given themselves time because, as many people have calculated before, these basically work out as being somewhat similar overall. Because I think we are expecting there to be some variation in episode length, but that they'll all be very close to an hour if they're following the One Piece live action format. So yeah, they just talked that, yeah, the second and third seasons were more serialized, of course. Then there's an interesting one here. Interestingly, they spoiler this out. So when you take an episode, and I'm guessing he says something like referring to this character, like the name of this episode, and then you take an episode in which this character is in, you realize both of these are separate episodes in the animated series, and they take place in different environments. But they're both about the same kind of character, and so those kind of match up thematically. So we put the two of them together in the same storyline. So that was kind of the process for creating the serialized version of what was essentially an Adventure of the Week show. So what's being referred to here? What are we talking about here in terms of some of the bigger changes? Like, obviously we know there's stuff like Teo and the Mechanist are being moved from episode 17 in the Northern Air Temple into Omashu, which is episode 5 of the original show. Is it that? You could maybe compare like Bumi and the Mechanist. They'd probably get on. I'm not sure they're necessarily talking about that. Are they referring to maybe like the Blue Spirit, like kind of Zuko / the Blue Spirit and Jet, as like they're kind of very separate things? Are they doing like Jet and June to a certain degree? I'm interested to see what this one was necessarily in, because I'm guessing the reason that this was removed is because Albert Kim probably answered this question, realized that, hey, in terms of marketing, we don't want to spoil that just yet. So it's something they don't want to mention. So that's why I don't think it's the Teo situation. It might be Jet, because we're a little bit unsure about when exactly the Jet thing is going to happen. Because, again, I don't think they're doing full Jet. So my guess is while Aang is off doing the, gets captured, Blue Spirit comes to get him out, Katara and Sokka have to be doing something, and I don't think the live action is just going to have them like sick with a cold, basically. So I'm guessing this is maybe where Katara has a bit of a side plot with Jet, and obviously that plot does relate to kind of Sokka as well. So those two can have the Jet plot at the same time, and it's like, okay, that's what we're going for. The two sort of like renegade characters in a way, Blue Spirit and Jet, now kind of interlinked in the same episode. And then of course the kind of fun thing later on in book 2 is that like actual Zuko and Jet will meet, and you can see some of those similarities. Is that what they're talking about? Because again, we're trying to figure out what the changes truly are at their core, but it's hard to judge exactly. I'm assuming that's what they're talking about here, because we have placement of specific things at this point, but yeah, Jet hasn't really been addressed too much. Same goes for the Blue Spirit stuff in terms of, again, what's going on outside of Aang and Zuko. They talk about the VFX here, of course, the idea of it being a travel show. And then Albert Kim mentions this in an interesting point here. Logistically speaking, that is also another reason we decided to do a little bit more of a Fire Nation story in the first episode, because it kind of gave us some regular sets and environment that we could go back to in every episode. Because our heroes are traveling from location to location every episode, but we can always go back to the Fire Nation throne room for a scene or two in each episode, and it gave us a little bit of stability in the storytelling. So that was another reason for bringing them more into the fore in the first season. That is a very, very interesting thing. Fire Nation's story in the first episode. That's interesting in terms of like, well, I guess like obviously on the Aang side of things, it's Sokka, it's Katara and Sokka discovering Aang, and we'll see how exactly far they go. But I'm guessing they're going to do the 101, 102, and probably 103 in there as well. That part of it. And then I'm guessing like basically half the episode has to be, of course, the intro with the Air Nomad genocide. We don't know how extended of a scene that's going to be. You have to obviously introduce Zuko and have him get incorporated into the plot. But then I'm guessing you will be introducing Ozai and Azula in the opening episode as well, in terms of like, by the end of the first episode, I'm assuming like pretty much everyone is going to be aware that, okay, the Avatar is back. Zhao will be on the hunt. We'll see how heavily involved Zhao is in this, because like it's interesting. Like they've mentioned the Ozai Zuko Agni Kai, but they haven't mentioned the Zhao Zuko Agni Kai. Are they changing that? Is that still going to happen? Because obviously Zhao is on Kyoshi Island, but they're not really mentioning like how he first kind of encounters Zuko. So how that all plays out will be quite interesting. But just highlighting that, okay, so they're just highlighting that there's this stability in season 1 of like, we always will cut back to the Fire Nation to, I suppose, see what they're planning in the background. And I'm guessing we'll see stuff like Azula sent out on her mission, maybe Zhao getting orders from Ozai, Ozai himself reacting to what's going on, that sort of things. So interesting. So yeah, then they talk about bending, of course. Again, the water thing is very similar to what was said in a previous interview, I think from just earlier this week. Albert Kim talks about how air is also challenging because realistically you don't see it except its effect on other things. So that's a good point. And oddly, fire is the easiest. So an interesting point. So there's that. Stunt work, again, is a very similar answer to what was given in quite a lot of the situations, and we've heard the actors talk about this as well. The 6-week boot camp gets brought up once again. That's all fine. Then they just talk about the mix of sort of well-known actors versus kind of new actors, and praising the cast once again. Then we go into the CG characters, so like Appa and Momo, and focusing on that. It's sort of the stuff that we've roughly heard from the other interviews, extended out a little bit, but I don't think there's too much necessarily to go into all that much. There is the mention about Avatar State here. That's the next question. And this ends up with, again, him reiterating from the other interview. And in fact, we ended up tweaking the rules a little bit for our story purposes. And it'll be interesting to see whether fans pick up on that and what they think of that. But we kind of streamlined a lot of those rules and came up with something I worked across on it. And I'm like, So they're changing the rules, in their mind, streamlining it, not further complicating it. And he's almost questioning, will fans notice that there's a difference to it? And again, I brought this up when I addressed this before, in terms of like, okay, what are the rules about the Avatar State? Prior to Aang learning to control it, how does the Avatar State activate? 1, mental, kind of mental/emotional extremes of like, if Aang is extremely emotional, he can go into the Avatar State in terms of like defense mechanism in that way. There's the defense mechanism when it comes to his life being at risk. The Avatar State will activate in that case as well. That's how, of course, in the original, he ended up in the ice in the first place. To save him from drowning at sea, the Avatar State activated and sealed him in the iceberg. And there's other examples, like when Zuko knocks him off the boat in like basically the second episode. To prevent him from drowning, the Avatar State activates and, he comes up out of the water. We know that that is the case, that there's the defense mechanism as well. Then, there's also the more Avatar-specific instance of this, which is that when, in a way, the spirit of one of the past avatars is kind of channeled, or you're in like an area that relates to them with regards to like a statue or a spiritual location, that is a way to effectively connect and channel that avatar, and that's where we get those moments of like Kyoshi taking over Aang's body, Roku effectively taking over Aang's body, which I'm guessing is what we will do here. And I'm wondering, is that what they're maybe focusing on a little bit more, in that they're not using it as much? That's the other change. They're not using the avatar state as much as they did in season 1. So what scenes are they taking out? I'm guessing they're taking out maybe those smaller bits of like maybe go into the avatar state in like the storm. That might not even happen in this one. Maybe the end of episode 2, that avatar state moment they might take out. And they might emphasize most of the time it happening here because of a connection to a past life. And this is how you can bring your Roku actor into play, your Kyoshi actors into play, and your Karuk actor into play, is that you want to see them in, you know, avatar state or avatar state adjacent scenes. Otherwise, I'm not overly sure what they're necessarily talking about as such here. Of course, there's stuff like, say, Roku talking to Zhong that I'm guessing just isn't here because it doesn't seem like Zhong is in this show. We'll see how that plays out. Are they just keeping that a secret? Because even though we haven't heard a lot about Zhao, they seem to be emphasizing that there is an arc for Zhao, but like that's a weird thing to do if you're taking out a bit of his backstory potentially of like him versus Zhong being a notable thing. But again, they're talking about having to kind of serialize this, and is that too much of a kind of one-off episode? And then you get into the idea of like, wait, when does Katara discover she has healing, and how does that come into play? Interesting stuff. Then we get into sort of what's been the kind of controversial topic of the week. It gets touched on a little bit here. And basically, you know, Albert Kim says the cartoon, for as great as it was 15 years ago. And there's a little bit of like, what are you going to say after this? Like, are you really going to say like the show is a bit outdated? And it's like, oh, I'm not really sure about that. There are certain roles I think that Katara did in the cartoon that we didn't necessarily also do here. I mean, I don't want to really get into a lot of that, but some gender issues that didn't quite translate. What do they mean here? Like, is this the whole sort of like, again, the Sokka sexism thing, in terms of the way that this sort of like showed itself in the show was sort of like this almost like, you know, Sokka's almost expectation of like, I'm the warrior in the group, my pants are damaged, you're the woman on the group, you are the one who should kind of fix them. Is that what they're talking about here? Which, if so, like, okay, I understand maybe like wanting to maybe alter that to perhaps be less blunt. But I think it doesn't help that like he basically brings up that like, oh yeah, here's this problem. I don't want to talk about it, but I'll just kind of allude to it. That's a bit of a like, not sure about that. This is where like this is the wrong time to not go into detail, because you are giving ammunition to a lot of people who are going to take this and run a mile with it. And we've already seen a bit of overreaction to this, bit of underreaction, I think, to it as well, but quite a lot of overreaction, as like a lot of people are grasping onto stuff like this as, here it is, the thing that really proves that the show is not going to be good. You know, this is why Mike and Brian left. And it's a bit, and that's where like it's hard to kind of agree with that, because like it's not representative of everything in the show, but it's also a little bit like, come on, word that a little bit better, or at least explain yourself a little bit more. And again, the IGN interviewer doesn't really help things by basically criticizing it in the same way the actors did. They basically agree, like, yeah. We had to guard against that kind of stuff. I'm like, okay, you're avoiding controversy. And if that's it, just say it. That's my thing with this, is that like, if that's your aim here, I think just be perfectly honest and say it. We were worried people would dislike Sokka inherently as a character if we did that arc. We are being cautious here. We are guarding against it. Is that what you mean? I just wish they'd be a little bit clearer about this. That like, we aren't really changing the character as much as like updating them, and it's like these are very similar words, kind of, that sort of thing. But I get the point that they're getting at here, but there's nuance to it. Like, it's going to be something that I think everyone's going to watch the show and see how they do, like Sokka's early arc, see what's going on with the portrayal of Katara that they're talking about here, and is this a big change or is it a tiny change? Like, why is this, like, in a way, the first thing that gets brought up when you talk about, like, these are some changes that need to happen with the show for reasons. But anyway, we'll move on. We needed to make sure that, in terms of, this is in relation to, okay, I think this connects with the whole comet timeline thing here of, they're not giving the comet comes at the end of summer, like you have under a year to master the elements. They're not doing that here because they don't know when season 2 is going to start filming or if they're confirmed for it. So they have to kind of, in a way, plan ahead and not set themselves a timeline they might not be able to kind of accurately line up with in terms of just real life logistics. So to make this work and to fit in with the format of the show, they're saying that we needed to make sure that Aang had a drive from the start. And so that's a change that we made. We essentially give him this vision of what's going to happen. And he says, I have to get to the Northern Water Tribe to stop this from happening. That gives him much more narrative compulsion going forward, as opposed to, let's make a detour and go ride the elephant koi. And I'm a little bit like, okay, so you're taking the 108 thing and moving it basically to the front. I take this to effectively be the comet. He has shown the comet as, this is, you need to stop the Fire Nation before the comet comes. You just don't know when it's coming, because you see a vision of the future through some sort of a spirit kind of type connection type thing. Or maybe he flashes back and gets some sort of a thing about Sozin's Comet, and that's maybe how the Sozin's Comet original flashback happens. We'll see how exactly it all goes down. But that's what they're going for here. So I'm guessing the idea is Aang knows the comet is the big thing, but they don't know when it is. So they kind of have to be like, okay, let's be a little bit kind of quick as we go through all of this stuff. Then they can reveal maybe in season 2 in the library or something like that, or find out about it through some other means that, hey, the comet is coming in 3 years, or like maybe a year has passed by the time we're in season 2, 2 years have passed. Then you can say it's coming a year from now, it's coming 2 years from now, depending on what timeline you want to set this show as, because it's going to have to be a different timeline. They talk about Mike and Brian here. Again, it's a very similar statement that's been given before. And then he just finishes by saying, I think that hopefully we honor, like I said, the spirit of the show that they originally created in the version that we made. Great. And that's how they end it here. Their opinion is that this will be the live action version of the show that the fans want. And they're pretty confident that that's what they're delivering. And I think it's shaping up very well. We can, over-exaggerate or undermine how much of a point some of these changes are. But overall, I think it has to be said, it is shaping up pretty well in terms of where the general popularity and excitement is surrounding the show. I'm seeing pretty much mostly positives, and really the kind of sexist Sokka thing's been the only kind of notable point of criticism, which I don't think has been helped from the lack of detail presented in some of these interviews. But look, this is part of your marketing. You say a thing, and if you don't say enough or you say too much, people are going to go off with stuff like that. It's just what happens. Otherwise, I like a lot of what's said here. There's not a lot of necessarily like reveals, because the one potential reveal here, they of course kind of spoiler out, but it maybe is something that you can actually latch onto here about like what exactly are they referring to here in terms of thematically similar things and stuff like that. But I I think it's a pretty good interview here. I like that this one was a little bit more in detail, that there was like follow-up questions it felt like asked, whereas I think the EW one was a little bit too almost like lacking in maybe full quotes and just, you know, presenting like, and then this was said in a minor quote. So anyway, good interview. And then we also, of course, had the King Bumi stuff from the very start of the video. So let me know what your thoughts were on all of that. What were your thoughts on Bumi, plus the little bit of the extra clip that we got from the stream? And then thoughts on anything we find out about in this big interview. So let me know your comments below, but that's been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.